Thank you very much, everybody. I really value the fact that you've taken time out of your day to join Arcadia on this webinar today. I really appreciate that. My name's Steve Ellis. I'm a partner at Arcadia Consulting. I'm joined today on this webinar by Michael Lynskey. Michael is the Vice President for Global Marketing from Smith Nephew. Introduce and welcome, Michael. Say hi to everybody.
Morning, Steve. Hello, everyone, wherever you are. Nice to be invited here by Steve to chat to you a little bit today. Hope you enjoy it.
Cheers, Michael. Thanks very much. And welcome, everybody, to the Productivity Power Up. All about productivity, but specifically looking at the productivity of teams. So how do we empower teams for success, and how do we enable those teams to be as productive as we possibly can? I guess from a macro perspective around productivity, we need to increase and improve productivity for almost macroeconomic existential reasons. So if we want to solve climate change or net zero, then we collectively as a planet need to be more productive in order to generate the funds to solve that problem, right? I guess also from a macroeconomic perspective, productivity is highly correlated to standards of living and the number of jobs that are available in the marketplace. If we're not increasing productivity, then that's going to be more difficult. I guess from a micro perspective, people on this call might be thinking, well, if my team can be more productive, then that might mean winning in the marketplace. Winning in the marketplace might be associated with salary increases or bonuses or promotion or job security. So it's evident that we need to drive some degree of productivity. When you hear me talking about productivity, there is an obvious connection with, is that economic production? Is that like GDP? But we're actually looking at labor productivity. So how do you increase the output per human hour or labor hour in the marketplace? So how do you, forgive me, because this is a turn of phrase that I feel a little bit uncomfortable, but how do you sweat the asset when the asset is human beings? So we're very much looking at the human element of productivity on this webinar today. I'm going to talk about three things to begin with, or there's sort of three parts to today's webinar. I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about productivity, talking about some changes that have made it hard or interesting for leaders to drive productivity, particularly the mix of generations that are now part of our teams. So many people will be familiar with the generations of Gen Z and millennials and Generation X and baby boomers, and we have more diversity of generations in our teams than ever before. So generations and the speed and quantity of change, in what way has speed and quantity of change and generational mix, in what way has that impacted leaders when it comes to leading teams and driving productivity? So I'm going to talk about that. Second thing, we're going to give Michael an opportunity to talk about his personal experience. How do some of these issues around driving productivity and performance show up in Smith Nephew and in his industry? And then the third part of today is a Q&A. In the past, when we've ran these webinars, we've been given the feedback that we'd like it to be a little bit more interactive. So we're going to make it as interactive as possible. So many of you will have access to the chat function. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any time during the webinar. We will either answer them when we see them, or we'll get to them during the Q&A section at the back end of today's webinar. Just on the topic of productivity to begin with then, at the last webinar, we ran a webinar just a few weeks ago around communication or presenting in a world of artificial intelligence. And how can artificial intelligence increase the efficiency and the efficacy of human production or human communication? So there's an example immediately, I guess, that triggers your brain that says, if we want to drive productivity, maybe it's technology-enabled productivity. We will touch on technology-enabled productivity, but we'll also talk about teamwork and team dynamics and how teams collaborate and work together in order to not just create efficiency, so we're saving time and saving money, but effectiveness because we're driving growth and we're driving output. So we'll explore both of those in a little detail. In the vein of driving interactivity and participation, I'm going to kick off straight away with a poll. So let me share with you the poll. Here's what I'd like you to participate in. You have two choices in terms of the way in which you address this poll. You can either use your phone and access the barcode or the QR code, if you like, or you can go directly onto Mentimeter. And the question that I'd like you to answer is, which of the following team characteristics, because we're talking about human productivity and team productivity, which of the following 4 characteristics would you say your business and the leaders in your business are strongest at? Are they really strong at establishing team purpose, the why of the work that they're doing, the purpose statement, if you like? To what extent are they good at or strongest at creating space to grow, empowering people so that they can grow and contribute to the organization? To what extent are they really good at creating a learning culture where they're inviting people to become experts and to drive contribution through the quality and expertise of their work? Or thirdly, or finally, to what extent are your leaders really good at creating psychological safety and accelerating trust and making people feel like they belong to that part of the organization and the output? So question number 1 is, which of the following are your leaders strongest at? So hopefully you can see the results of this survey. It looks like, based on your thoughts right now, the leaders are pretty good at driving a learning culture. So making sure that there's a drive for expertise, and pretty good at establishing the why. It looks like less good, if that's the phrase, if that's a proper piece of English language, maybe creating safety. So definitely the mastery side of things is coming through, creating a learning culture. Leaders are pretty good at that. Excellent. Okay, thank you for that. Interesting information. Let's go on to the second question, which is, which of the following are your leaders weakest at? The previous question suggested that they were really good at generating mastery, but obviously some clients or some leaders are not so good at generating mastery. But it seems to be that this psychological safety element, creating psychological safety, which of course, if you think about the logic of that, if you've got 100 people in the room all discussing a business problem or business opportunity, and you pretty much want all of them to contribute, all of them to stick their hand up with an idea, but 98 of them don't feel safe to do so, then it's unlikely that you're going to have the kind of productivity that you would get if everybody had that level of psychological safety. Okay, thank you for that. Interesting information. Hopefully that starts to give you some thoughts as to where in your business or where in your leadership development might you need to focus in order to drive some degree of team productivity. Maybe it's leaders, helping leaders to create psychological safety. Maybe it's helping leaders to continue what they're already doing around creating mastery or creating that learning culture. These 4 topics will begin to show up increasingly throughout this webinar. I promise we go into a little bit of content around productivity, the generational mix, and a little bit of content about the speed and quantity and extent of change, and in what way is that affecting leaders and their ability to drive productivity. So let's get into a little data about productivity. So we've had a really bumper period when it comes to productivity. There are definitely markets like China, India, Ethiopia, Poland, where there's been tripling and quadrupling levels of productivity over the last 20 or 30 years. But they're coming from a relatively small base. So when you aggregate or include those in the data of established markets like North America, like Europe, because those markets are so significantly big, as a globe or as a planet, there's been a gradual decrease in the rate of productivity growth. So we're still growing. The planet is still increasing its labor output, but it's doing so at a decreased rate. And that particularly shows up in some of the more established markets, whether that's Europe or the UK, the US, Singapore or Hong Kong. The rate of productivity increase per labor hour is actually on the decrease. And that's got implications for standard of living. It's got implications for salary increases. It's got implications for further investment. A recent McKinsey study with regards to the potential for productivity growth suggests that there is significant potential to improve productivity. But right now, the expectation is that 60% of the potential solutions are largely down to efficiency. So how do we use digitization to save time or save money? How do we use systems to save time and save money? So largely efficiency-based productivity gains. There's an implication for that, because if you then save money, but only invest that in dividend or shares, that isn't necessarily investing for growth or output. And if we don't invest for growth and output, and we only invest for efficiency, then it's the growth and output that typically drives standard of living and typically drives the number of jobs in the marketplace and the salaries that people have in the marketplace. So there's a challenge to drive productivity, but there's a certain typology of that challenge. We can drive productivity by saving money and saving time through digital transformation and using AI from an efficiency perspective, but we probably equally need to drive output. We need to drive growth, because that is what's going to drive the standard of living for all the humans on the planet. So productivity seems to be a bit of a challenge, is pretty much what I'm saying. And it's particularly a challenge in the information or knowledge era that we're currently in. When we think about productivity through the ages, during the agricultural period, productivity was measured by the crop yield or the output as a ratio of the area of land. So how much yield of corn did I get from each hectare or acre of land, or how much crop yield did I get given that I've got 10 farmers? So typically we would measure it in that way. And when we were trying to improve that yield or that productivity, we started exploring things like crop rotation or fertilizer or the utilization of tractors and machines in order to get more output per human hour from that particular field, right? That was quite easy to measure, and it was easy to drive. And then in the Industrial Revolution, productivity again was how many cars can we make per unit of 50 employees in a factory, or how many cars can we make given we've just invested 10 million on some capital equipment within the factory. So again, pretty linear way of being able to measure and take a look at productivity. And as a result, pretty easy for leaders and organizations to investigate how they could drive productivity. How do you drive factory efficiency? We'll do some time and motion studies. We won't just have one factory shift. We'll get everybody working 24 hours. We'll have a morning, an afternoon, and an evening labor force. We'll look at systems and process improvement to drive that productivity per human hour. Then we get to our period, the knowledge and information period. And it's really difficult to measure output in this sector or in this period. There's no single track of input or output. So let's take a look at this webinar, right? It's an hour of your time, an hour of my time, an hour of Michael's time. There's a lot of time that's gone into this, labor time. But it's very difficult to measure the output of that unless you all decide to, from my perspective, or let's have a chat with Arcadia to see if they can help us with leadership development or team development or driving productivity. And the cause and effect of that might be, you might call us in 2 years' time for that, as opposed to the cause and effect that shows up in a field in the agricultural revolution or in a factory in the industrial revolution. That's quite linear and quite easy to measure. Human beings in the knowledge and information sector, they've got complex interrelated activities that are variable over time. So it's not like I'm doing webinars all day and therefore I can see the relationship between my hours of doing webinars and the output of revenue that might generate, right? I'll be doing a webinar now, and then I might be running a training course, then I might go to a sales meeting, then I might be doing some research. So we've got all these multiple activities going on that are not always that easy to measure the output from it. And as a result, leaders in the information and knowledge era have really struggled to drive productivity through human beings. And as a result, we start doing some weird things to measure productivity. We start thinking that productivity is how many emails people send. Productivity is, well, they're in the office between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. That must be a metric or measure of their output or their productivity. Well, at least they're present. They're even present when they're poorly. They come in when they're stressed or they're ill, and that suddenly becomes, well, I like that person. They're really useful. They're really productive because they're always here. And that's possibly a sort of root cause of some of the issues that we're having at the moment around whether do we want people working in the office or are we okay with people working at home? Well, we can't see them when they're working at home. Are they being productive? So looking at productivity or human productivity has been challenged in the knowledge and information period. And I'm not sure we've got it right. I'm not sure that we're getting the most out of each human hour when we start thinking that visible activity, email activity, presenteeism is the metric. I'm not sure that works. And I'm not sure it works for Generation Zs or millennials either. This quote was taken from a recent McKinsey report on productivity, where they talk about the productivity paradox. Interacting via email, via Zoom, via Microsoft Teams is easier than ever, but true productive value-creating collaboration, well, that's not as easy as ever across multiple regions, multiple time zones, across multiple different levels of activity. So productivity isn't that easy to really start driving. I'll close on productivity by saying there are some classic organizational strategies to drive productivity, often associated with efficiency, saving time and saving money, not always associated with driving growth and driving output. So digital transformation will make things easier for people by giving them access to information a lot quicker. We'll use artificial intelligence, or in order to drive productivity, we'll go and acquire a different business and then do some organizational redesign and take some humans out. So we've got less humans producing the same output in terms of revenue or EBIT. Some classic ones would be give all the people in Africa a laptop, and that would drive their productivity because they'd be way more efficient, right? So capital investment into machines per worker typically drives productivity. And we've seen that over years. Every time you've had technological innovation, it's typically driven productivity, but usually because it drove efficiency, not necessarily output or growth. And then governments can drive productivity by doing tax exemptions for certain industries where we go, that's a growth industry, that's a more productive industry. Let's reduce the tax burden on that in order to drive the mix of productivity across different industries. So there's some classic organizational strategies, and then there's a bunch of human strategies, and that's the real focus of this webinar and hopefully your focus. How can leaders drive productivity out of each human within their team? Well, typically by driving skills, improving talent, really rapid reskilling where organizations have changed or the market has demanded new skills. How can you really fastly, speedily retrain people? Clearly, if we can get them to collaborate in a more efficient and effective way, but to collaborate, they've got to be psychologically safe. To collaborate, they've got to know what they're collaborating on. So they've got to be purpose-led. So teamwork and collaboration. Clearly, if we've got strong R&D, we've got strong innovation, we've got strong creativity, we're going to reinvent our products, and those products might be worth more in the marketplace. And if they're worth more in the marketplace, for every human hour that goes in producing that product, I'm going to generate more revenue or more EBIT, and therefore I'm more productive. How can we get them to utilize technology? But importantly, how can the teams adopt technology really quickly, given the speed of change? And the last one, that not to be underestimated, that we won't spend too much time on this webinar, is health and well-being. In a recent McKinsey study, they suggest that health and well-being, where the top 10% of organizations that really incentivize and invest in health and well-being are 23% more profitable than the bottom 10%. And you can see the obvious reason why. They're energized, they're fulfilled, they feel good, therefore they produce well, and therefore they generate more revenue and more output for the organizations. So productivity, in summary, is in growth in productivity is in decline. What do organizations do about it? Well, the challenge is, how do you measure it? And if we think measuring it is done through presenteeism or number of emails, then I don't think that's going to work. I think we might struggle with the measurement dimension of it. We could drive efficiency, and efficiency might save money, but if that's not reinvested into growth, then it's not going to be reinvested into standard of living and jobs and salaries. It's more likely to be reinvested into dividend, right? So hopefully we recognize that we need to do more on the right-hand side in order to drive growth. What else is going on? So productivity is, a challenge for everybody. And all of those human dimensions are, there's an added complexity, which is leaders are trying to manage a huge diverse population. Diversity of generations population. So many of you will be familiar with the generational shifts that are going on. Baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. That brings with it some leadership challenges around how to maximize those different generations' values and motivators. And it seems, I know this is a generalization, but it seems that they have different values and different motivations. And if they have different values and motivations, we need to tap into those motivations in order to drive their productivity. What's important to recognize is across most of the established markets, and I've shared a European marketplace, an Asian marketplace, US marketplaces, that within the next 10 years, millennials and Generation Zs are going to occupy over 60 to 70% of your workforce. And as a result, if that's true, we need to learn rapidly how to drive that workforce to be as productive as it possibly can be. So what is it that drives that workforce to be as productive as it possibly can be? So if you take a look at these three questions, and again, I recognize it's a generalization. So hopefully this is just triggering some of your thought process. If you were born between 1981 and 2000, you're part of that millennial Generation Y group of people. If you were born beyond 2001, you're part of that Generation Z group of people. Which of the following describes your attitudes at work? Well, tech savvy. So if they're tech savvy, they should be able to adapt to new technology quicker. They're full of aspiration and hope. They quite like diversity. They quite like collaboration, and they really enjoy being empowered. But interestingly, the leaders aren't very good at empowering them, because sometimes leaders think they're not worthy of being empowered, or leaders think, well, they're not as good as me. Leaders think they don't know what they're doing. I've got 30 years experience. I'll do it, rather than empowering them to do it. So how do you engage and how do you enable collaboration and empowerment? With the Generation Zs, very flexible. They really like the purpose-driven agenda, the societal impact. They really enjoy the relatability with what I'm doing and what impact that's having on the world, or what I'm doing and what impact that's having on other people around me. And they enjoy that connection with other people around them. So if we're to drive productivity through generations, we need to appeal to these characteristics as leaders. And the last thing, what else has changed? The speed and quantity of change now means that we need to have more adaptive and agile teams. If we went back 100 years as a leader, maybe it's a farmer, and the farmer is leading a bunch of farmhands. Well, you might have that team for 20 years or 30 years doing pretty much the same thing. If you were a leader in the Industrial Revolution in factories, you again might have the same team for 10, 15, 20 years doing pretty much the same systematic thing. Now, in the information and knowledge era, we might only have teams for 3 months before a number of those team members move and join another team. So what does that mean? So the World Economic Forum, that means, resilience, flexibility, agility, curiosity, lifelong learning. Those are all going to be critical skills for leaders to enable their teams to have in order to drive the productivity and output of those teams. And that's tough to do when those teams are distributed all over the world. It's tough to do when you only meet them or have them for 3 months or 6 months whilst they're working on a transformation project. And they're sometimes tough when post-COVID, half of them are at home and half of them are in the office. So that's quite a tough context in which we're trying to drive productivity through these teams. So 3 things: productivity, we need to drive it, but we also need to not just drive efficiency, we need to drive effectiveness, output. Generations that demand different motivational strategies for leaders, and change demands how do we accelerate trust within our teams in order to be as productive as possible. And that's why I come back to those 4 first questions that I posed earlier. How do leaders create psychological safety and accelerate trust? How do they accelerate it? Because you might only have that team for 6 months. How do you accelerate that psychological safety? Because you want all of them to contribute. You don't want them to be passive. How do leaders make sure that the work they're asking of their team is connected to purpose and it's got a really obvious intention? Why? Because Generation Zs and Millennials value that. They want that. They want that connectedness. How do leaders upskill people really quickly? Or even create an environment where people want to be upskilled really quickly? So how do you create that mastery mindset and that learning culture? And we know that Generation Zs and Millennials really like empowerment and collaboration. So how do you create that space versus being micromanaged? So those 4 things seem to me to be pretty critical to driving, in today's context, driving productivity. So in summary, from my piece, before I hand you over to Michael to get his experience, I sort of characterize this in these 5 ways. I think for leaders to drive productivity from their teams, set out your leadership intention. And I think there's a transition in leadership intention. We can't, I don't believe, and I know that there is cultural difference here, but I don't think in a modern world we can have the authoritarian, hierarchical, I'm the boss, command and control mindset, where everything's down to me. I think we need to build trust and followership. We need to be slightly more servant leadership. We need to believe that everybody's got more potential and therefore give them the space to grow into that potentiality. We need to be very good at communicating and engaging with our teams on this purpose. Build the why. Why are we doing it? Is it revenue? Is it profit? Is it to impact the planet? Is it to impact society? In what way does the work that I do lead to something? So rather than having a silo mindset where people just follow instructions and do the task, we've got to connect the task with purpose. So it's about the customer first. It's about the company. And I, as a leader, might be coming last. And obviously, if we do a good job of that, you're going to get more engagement and more buy-in. If you get more engagement and buy-in, you're probably going to get more productivity. We've got to create space for people to grow. I see this micromanagement. I see this strategy called looking at people's presenteeism, looking at people's email traffic, or indeed just measuring the number of hours that they're at work because they're there at 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. at night. That's not the same as creating space, creating an opportunity for people to grow into capability and to contribute in many different ways. Mastery mindset. We don't want people feeling like they're going to get told off or that mistakes have huge consequences. To create productive output, we need more R&D. We need more innovation. We need more creativity. To have creativity, we need people to undertake experiments, trial and error, see what works in order to drive that productivity. So for that, we need a learning culture and we need a mastery mindset. And finally, and probably most importantly, given what you said in that little survey at the beginning, to enable all of those, we first need a lot of psychological safety. So how do we make it safe with inclusion and belonging and making people feel really comfortable about challenging things? We need to be better at listening as leaders. Get these things right, and I think we can improve human output and productivity. With that, I'm so pleased to allow Michael to get his voice on this call. Michael, welcome again, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your day today. But also, I know you've prepped some of this, so thank you very much for your investment in this webinar. I'd love to hear from you, and I'm sure the audience would. What's your experience of leading teams and driving productivity at Smith Nephew?
Hi everyone. Just a little bit of background. I'm Global VP for Marketing for Smith Nephew, but a lot of what I'll talk about today comes from my time leading various business units around the world in medtech. So leading sales and marketing teams, particularly with reference, I'll try and reference back to the time if I think back to COVID and the challenges that created, but then also the opportunities that it brought with it to implement new technology. But now what I see is that new technology having a negative impact in lots of ways on our teams. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I think that to give some perspective on Smith Nephew, right? We are a healthcare company. We sell hips and knees and trauma products. We sell wound care products. So we interact directly with healthcare providers across the world on a daily basis. We turn over about $5 billion. We're the biggest, oldest UK medtech company and the biggest UK-based med tech company outside of pharmaceuticals. So we're a decent sized organization. We've got, I think it's 17,000 employees, something like that. What happened during COVID, to give you an idea, a lot of our teams we have clinicians, we have a lot of Gen X, right? We've got a few people approaching baby boomer. Our workforce of our sales and marketing teams is quite old at that point, and that's changed over the last couple of years. But people's life was being with customers in hospitals. So if you think of the impact on COVID on lots of different organizations, for us it was huge because people couldn't go to work. Not just they couldn't go to work, they could work on Teams. There actually was nothing for them to do because their whole job was being with customers. And that forced a huge sea change for us in terms of how we communicated with these teams, how we spent time with them, how we kept them motivated, obviously until the pandemic ended. What that's led to is, I think, an over-reliance for us now on the technology around Teams and Zoom. I think when I look at our teams now and where we're still being successful, I have a phrase that I use with my team sometimes is, I can't remember the last time we had an amazing pivoting idea on Teams or Zoom. Right? I think since the pandemic, we had to make great ideas then and build great teams, and I'm not sure it's possible to do that anymore with the way that this technology has moved forward. Sometimes I think we'd solved the problem of mobile communication with each other with the telephone, and I've just added another level to it, which makes you sit in a chair while you're doing it rather than having a walk or doing something else, so everyone can see you, so you can contribute on that call. So I wonder now, as we move forward, what that new world will look like. What we try to do with our teams is we spend a lot of time focusing on our why, and we do provide people with a lot of freedom. So our why is really simple. We're here to heal people, to help people, to make sure that more of our great products get on more people, and to support our clinicians, and the sales results follow from that. So we have a great why. It's called Life Unlimited. It's clear to everybody. We talk about shaping the market and shaping wound care and shaping in our other businesses. So we have a great why. And I think that's a really, really nice thing for us. We're quite lucky to have that in healthcare because at the end of the day, everything that we do has got a patient at the end of it. So our why is quite strong. I think sometimes where we lose ourselves is, how do we make sure that people feel the way that they're getting to that why is the right way? And how do we create that environment for them? I think for all of us in businesses now, I don't know any of the businesses that are on this call, but we're generally all in some sort of transformation, aren't we now? On a daily, weekly basis, right? And I think I try to, there's a model that I've used in the past around transformation, and it talks about when transformations go wrong. And this relates directly to teams, I think, for us now. You know, you get issues in a transformation when people don't understand what you're doing or where you're going. So there's no understanding of the goal, right? And that can happen in any team at any level. It could be a marketing project, it could be an R&D project. Why are we doing what we're doing? There's no change governance. We're not checking in with people. Does this change work? How does it impact other departments? When we're bringing out a new product, we've got R&D in Singapore, we've got R&D in the US, we've got R&D in Hull. We've got all the markets that we need to work with and lots of customers. So how do we look at that change governance and manage it? Sometimes we go back to the old methodologies of management is there's not enough leadership in the teams. You know, someone's not taking ownership and driving that change and that understanding. And sometimes our managers really, really do need help with that. And we've actually had a lot of help from Arcadia in the past around this, is how do we help our managers to lead effectively in these environments? Sometimes in a lot of our teams now, the workload's too high. You know, it's great that you can work at home, but when home's your office, you're always at work. And also when you work in these global teams now, which have been, global teams are easier to be in now, aren't they? When you've got teams and you've got the technology. Some of our teams are starting at 6:30 in the morning, talking to APAC, and they're finishing at 8 o'clock at night, talking to the US. And you've really got to be conscious of that workload and how that impacts people. You also have, you know, some of the issues are poor alignment across departments, and there's a lot of work that goes into that. And then it's really, really easy in this virtual world to ignore the culture that you want in the team and how you drive that together. So what we try to do now is I've tried to have with my team is, you know, we may have a period where as a team, we talk every Monday morning, simple, 8:30, 1 hour, my team together. How's the weekend? How are you? Connecting, how's everyone doing, etc., etc. And what are we doing for the week? So that's the standard. Probably every month we'll be together. And we'll be together to talk about the big, important things that involve whiteboards and charts and all the things that are important to us as we make big decisions. Sometimes we have to do that on something like Mural or a system that helps us that we use online with our R&D partners, but sometimes we'll do that. But that being together is so important to us as we make decisions. Now, of course, in big international teams, that's not possible. But even in our big international teams, we'll try and make sure that we can have a meeting at some point that is that allows people to bring their ideas to the fore. Steve talked a little bit about our Gen Zs, and we're starting to see more Gen Zs, I like to say, creep into our organization or arrive in our organization now. And I had a chat with some of them yesterday. And I actually think that they're gonna, in some respects, they think about things and they'll action things more quickly than the millennials and the Gen Xs, right? They want faster, they have high expectations, they want things to be quick. TikTok generation, Instagram generation, call it what you want. They can contact all of their friends and do things in 2 or 3 minutes online, book a restaurant, get a cab, get some food, get a delivery. Everything's easy for them in terms of that. So they expect other things to be quick, but they really value connection. So they're the ones that are saying, can we meet? Can we meet? Can we be together? We want to be together. We want to go for a coffee. We want to go and have lunch. When can we all meet in the office? And that's a little bit different to the millennials, I think. Whereas where the Gen Z, they want that connection. So we're trying to bring a bit of that into things. And that's they need connection much more than the Gen X and the millennials for the people that are in my team anyway. So how do we create that culture for them? How do we make sure that they've got that culture? And that we can support them. We can make sure the Gen Xers are all starting to think about retirement now anyway. Well, saving, you know, and making sure that they can ease their way into that stage of life, while the majority of the work is getting done by the millennials. And you can see that from this webcast where Millie's done most of it and Steve's just turned up. You know, the majority of work these days is being done by the millennials in our organization. So helping them and understanding from them, because that is all about purpose. What are they there for? What's the purpose? Is it fair? Is it equitable? Does it feel right? So I'm rambling on a little bit now, but in terms of how we've really worked with these teams is what I try to do is make sure that immediately when we have any project, is to make sure whatever it is, writing a new sales scheme, writing a commission scheme, creating a product, whatever it may be, people understand the meaning and value of that as part of the Smith Nephew overall goal. So this is what we're doing today, and this is why it's important to get to our overall goal. We're doing a lot with cross-functional teams. All right. So when we have big issues now, what I really like to do is get as many people from as many different departments involved. So that gets you that alignment as quickly as possible. Whether that be in R&D, sales ops, sales commercial, a customer group, getting them involved early as we build the program or the team is really important. The leaders have to be present, lead by example, And what I mean by leading example is that's not working all the hours God sends. It's actually demonstrating the work-life balance that is effective to get that project done. And sometimes that is really long days and nights. But then at the end of that, it's about giving people the time and the freedom to have a little break and have a little relax when it's been so stressful, and a little reward and a little whatever it may be when that project's done. So making sure we lead by example, but hugely focusing on people, hugely. Are your people okay? Are they the right people? Have they got the mastery? Do they feel empowered? Making sure you have that connection in with your team so that the people in those teams are being treated by individuals within the team profile, but it's really helping them and they feel that value. You know, ultimately, it's a little bit old school, but we want people to be aligned with our goal and our mission. And some people just aren't going to be, and they're not going to want to do that work in that way, in that culture. Our culture is very care, collaborate, courage. And I say some people don't like to be that because some people don't care about other people as much, right? And they don't want to collaborate. And that's all right, because there's lots of other jobs for them in other places. They're not going to enjoy working here because our goal is to be focused on people and care about them and collaborate. And sometimes too much, and that slows us down. But some people don't really like that, and it's okay for them to go and work somewhere else. And then really making sure we keep that culture of positive engagement, accountability, responsibility, working together and working to a goal, keeping that at the center of it all. So communicating meaning and value, building cross-functional teams, leading by example, being present, culture at the center, people at the center. And I think there's ways to do that around a bit of Teams, a face-to-face meeting, a conference call every now and again, a one-to-one call every now and again, making sure you communicate to try and keep the rhythm in your teams. I always talk about what's the cadence in the rhythm in our business. When do we talk about this? When do we action this? What happens in the third week of June? And if you set that standard and that process out, you can build the teamship into it, I think, more easily.
Cheers, Michael. Thank you for that. And there's a few things that stood out. So I want to pick up. It's interesting you said communication showed up a lot. Communication of the why, and communication within the change governance, making sure, and you almost closed with that, which was the governance and the cadence piece. If you get that cadence thing right, then actually your attention can be on the people, because you've got that system. You get the system right and your attention can be on the people. So communication of purpose came out a lot. Communication of purpose and why came out a lot. One of the things that I noted was you mentioned workload can be too high, and that's tough where you've got teams all over the planet and people are up at 5 a.m. and people are still awake. And it's interesting. And again, that's got implications for generations. It seems that I read a recent McKinsey report that said 50% of Gen Zs are chronically stressed and anxious, which means it's not even an event that's causing stress. They're just a basal level of stress. A second data point from the same report was that 20% of the workforce, 20% of the whole workforce, is suggesting that they've got a sense of burnout. So that goes back to that health and well-being piece. So I thought,
and I think I think we could do a lot better at that. We're a healthcare company. We're not as good. Other healthcare companies are really good at it, and I think we could get a lot better. But I think that it's allowing people the time after an intense time, I think. So sometimes you've got to, I remember a point with one of my teams, I was like, guys, we just need to stop. We've got so many ideas, because they're all super bright and super motivated. They've got ideas and ideas and ideas and ideas. So we've just got to stop and execute the stuff that we've got, because we're going to kill ourselves and each other by coming up with more and more and more great ideas that are probably going to help us in the business, but we don't have the physical capacity and the time to deliver on it. And I think it's people will work really hard if they enjoy their job, and they'll feel less stressed. I do think that generation you talk about, the Gen Z generation, I look at my kids, a lot of their stress in their life comes from their telephone. The constant interaction, social interaction, Instagram, TikTok, this, the constant. you know, I notice a big change in them when they're not on their phones for a little bit, or they have a little break, or they're on holiday and they're on it less. And, you know, I think that we've got to be really conscious of that generation are constantly on. And then you add on a job on top of that and some pressure from a job on top of that, then all of a sudden you're taking that, to your point, that basal level of stress and just adding something really important that's valuable to them, that's about money, that's about et cetera, et cetera. I think you need to be really careful with that generation.
It's interesting. I mean, when I think about my distraction, I used to get distracted by the telephone maybe 5-10 times a day. Then 20 years ago, distracted by email. Now I'm distracted by WhatsApp, Microsoft Teams messages, emails, and they interrupt the prioritized activity that I should be doing. So I'm working on something, and then I'm constantly being interrupted by something, some of which is social, a photograph here, or a request for a social event there, but also just constantly bombarded by multiple sources. Now, I suspect Generation Zs and millennials are better at dealing with that. But there's a secondary outcome, which is, do they lose sight of priority? So going back to your earlier point, sometimes there's so much going on, we just need to execute, or we need to prioritize what we're doing and go, let's get this done, versus 1,000 other ideas or a thousand other distractions.
And I think that's a great point. And that's when I think that cross-functional team building and ideas, sometimes we just have to say, right, we're doing this face-to-face. We're all in Hull, we're all in Watford. We're doing it face-to-face in one day. Let's just get it done.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, I think things take longer on Teams. Things take longer now. You can talk more often, to your point. You can connect better. But I think everything just takes a bit longer.
Yeah.
Because you can't, and you don't get a deep level of conversation about an issue on Teams. Well, we don't anyway.
Well, you said in your opening remarks, you got your 8:30 connection point, and then you weekly, and then you've got your monthly be together, and your phrase was to really discuss what matters most, what really matters. And I think there's a challenge, because we on a daily basis get bombarded by 100 things that might matter but don't matter most. What matters most in order to be purposeful, be intentional, and get stuff done, which get stuff done could be a tagline for productivity, right? Get stuff done.
I think that's a good point. Oh, sorry, Steve. I think that recently I'm sure many people have seen the little Barack Obama clip from the interview that he did recently. It's been floating around on LinkedIn, and he talks about, and they say, what's your advice for your daughters or for the Gen Z or the young people? He says, just learn to get things done. Just learn how to get things done in groups with other people. Go to your boss and just learn how to do things, and say to your boss, I can do that. I can take it on. I can deliver it. He says people lose sight of that in everything that's going on. Is how do you get things done? A PowerPoint, a presentation, a video, organizing a meeting, whatever it may be at that level of career, a brand plan. Just try and get it done.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that. There's a few questions coming, Michael. So I thought we should address some of those. Well, we've got quite a few, some big issue topics. So we've got, what role does company culture play in enhancing productivity, and how can it be cultivated? I have an answer, but I'd love your perspective. And then there's a second question: how do you recommend handling underperforming team members whilst maintaining overall team morale? Do you want to take a stab at either of those from your perspective?
Yeah, do you want to just repeat? Sorry, I'm just looking in the chat, see if I can see it. Sorry, can
these two are in the Q&A tab.
Right, okay.
So first one was, what role does company culture play in enhancing productivity, and how can it be cultivated? And the second one is, how do you recommend handling underperformance in team members whilst maintaining overall team morale?
Yeah, I think for me, and it sounds a little bit twee, but I just think culture is everything. In your teams, I think the way that you operate and the way that you are together, the standards you set for each other. I always think sports teams are a great microcosm of performance, right? Whoever it is, even Liverpool, Steve, is many of the great sports teams, it's the culture that's made them successful. They don't need the big manager at the front telling them what to do. The coach tweaks, he helps, he creates the environment where they're really well trained, so they've got mastery. When they're on the pitch, they've got autonomy. They have controls in terms of people looking after them. So they've created this environment, but ultimately, it goes down to the culture of that team. Is the culture of that team that they're behind 7 points in basketball, they call that? Is the culture that they, when they're on top, they switch off, whatever it may be. I think sports are a microcosm of that, but I do think the culture, and so much of that culture is set by the leader of that team or that organization or whoever it may be. And that's not in the, the old school leadership way. This is how I behave. This is how I'm going to treat you. This is how I want us to work together. And this is how we're going to get rewarded. And there's a really nice model by a guy called Patrick Lynskey called organizational health. And he talks about creating a cohesive leadership team. And he talks about the questions you should always ask yourself. And, they're not esoteric at all. They're a bit, you can make them more simple. It's like, why do we exist? What are we here for in our team? Why are we here? How are we going to behave towards each other? What do we do every day? How are we going to succeed by doing that? What's the most important thing right now? And then who's going to do what? Yeah. And I think if you have those things in your head, you can build a culture and that culture can be fast moving, relentless, whatever it may be that works for you, or it can be a culture of care and collaboration that moves more slowly. But I think it's everything really, because I think even in any of the teams that I've been involved in, at the end of the day, we can have the greatest strategy in the world, but if no one wants to do it, because the culture is that we don't believe in that strategy and we don't follow the rules and we do whatever we want, then we'll never get anywhere.
But again, for me, it goes back to clarity of purpose. But you also need clarity of culture. What's acceptable behavior? What's good behavior? Yeah. What's collaborative behavior? What does it look like? And I think the answer to the second question is included in the first question. So how do you deal with underperformance? Well, culturally, how do you deal with underperformance? Do you nip it in the bud straight away? Do you call it out? I think there's loads of research on the role of feedback, performance management, making sure. So underperformance could be met with feedback, it could be met with coaching, but it's best done as soon as possible. Nothing will undermine the culture. Well, I'm sure there's many things that undermine the culture, but what I observe does undermine the culture is when very good people see less productive team members not receiving that feedback, not getting the coaching, not receiving any intervention at all. It just gets accepted. The challenge, of course, goes back to one of our modern day challenges, which is how do you really see the cause and effect of somebody's inputs and somebody's outputs? And leaders fall foul of the visible heuristic. Well, I think they're doing a good job. Why? They're always on the Teams call, or they very quickly respond to my emails, or they very quickly respond to my Microsoft Teams messages or my WhatsApp. So we've got to really get close to what underperformance actually is. But I think if it is showing up, a culture of intervention sooner rather than later typically helps.
Yeah, always. Yeah. We're lucky in sales teams, right? Because underperformance just looks like your sales numbers have gone down, right? So in sales, it's easy, right? A few months of underperformance, a few field visits, a few decent questions around, does this person understand their role and what they're doing and why they're missing the targets? It can be easy to manage. It's more difficult for people in a marketing position or a back office position or a position where the output is not as visible. I get that. Yeah. But I would always, you've got to create an environment where you're on top of those things as the leader and manager, because that's the expectation that everybody else has for you, right? Your great people expect you to do it. Your great people expect you to do it.
Expect you to intervene. For me, you'll have a better chance of managing underperformance when you deliver better change governance. Change governance helps to reveal the inputs and the outputs. Yeah. Absent any change governance, and you're probably using the visible heuristic of like email traffic and stuff like that. I'm mindful of time. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of distinctions. One, questions on the chat function now. There was a question to do with How can we effectively convince leaders in emerging markets that investing in growth and development of their people is more beneficial in the long run than just focusing on immediate revenue and sales revenue? Emerging markets are still really, really productive. They're getting massive productivity gains. I mentioned Ethiopia, Poland, China, India. With a labor market that's pretty, you've got massive number, you've got billions of people to tap into. So I'm not surprised that leaders are just looking at output, output, output. I think the persuasive message is about staff retention. I think talent retention, and I think the persuasive message is about that talent being increasingly innovative and creative. Again, according to McKinsey, the future growth of emerging markets is largely down to human beings integrating technology as quickly as possible. So making sure they've got access to that technology, but also building teams that are innovative and creating new products and new services in order to continue to drive productivity. Inevitably, there's an S curve of products, and there's an S curve of productivity too. So at some point, those, and we've witnessed it in China already, those markets will begin to slow down in their growth. They're still growing brilliantly, but they begin to slow down. So when a product starts to slow down in its productivity, or a market does, then innovation and creativity is the driver of the next phase. Well, what's going to do that? So I think the argument for your leaders is integration of technology and new innovation and creativity, and you would need to evidence that. I think there's a second question that I thought was
just on that, Steve. I totally get that. I ran our Poland business for 6 months as a general manager, and getting those people off the road to learn new skills and do new things because the market was growing so much was really, really difficult. And I think that it is hard. I think one of the things that we've done over the years of our emerging markets, where we've got so much growth, but the people we start to see some problems with compliance. We have to be very careful in how we deal with our things. We start to see some things start to get stretched, some things start to miss. So, taking that time to pull people back in, to retrain, to refocus, to re-energize, and then tracking that output afterwards.
Yeah.
Is always a nice way to do it. Like, get them in, train them, and then demonstrate that worked. And,
well,
you can do that.
I think that last bit is the key, right? Whenever you're trying to persuade leaders or execs to invest, their thought process is return on investment. So yes, if you're going to get them together, demonstrate the value of getting them together in terms of return on investment. What did that deliver? What impact did that have? And I think that's true for there was another question in the chat function along those lines. The don't get together, do everything on Zoom, do everything on Teams. That's an efficiency productivity strategy. It's to save time and save money, right? Now you're asking, well, I want to spend money and use time by getting people together. Well, the answer then is, how do you demonstrate the return on investment of that? And is that through greater staff engagement, greater staff commitment, greater staff retention, and/or productivity output, more ideas, better execution. And I think leaders could do well to focus on that.